Hello everyone, thank you for joining DIGITIMES Asia Supply Chain Webinar. I'm Rebecca Wu, your MC today. In today's session, we'll be discovering how to reform global supply chains and build resilience in the post-pandemic era. We're honored to have Mark Millar, the author of Global Supply Chain Ecosystems, as our keynote speaker today. Before we start, I'd like to remind that if you have any questions, feel free to leave your message in the chat room on the right side. Our speakers and experts will help to answer during or after the session. Since your opinion matters to us, we'll be sending gifts today. The first 50 participants that complete the feedback form will win a $5 Amazon gift card. So stay tuned till the end and don't miss your chance to win the prize. And now let's welcome our keynote speaker, Mark Millar. Mark Millar is a respected authority on supply chain and logistics, an internationally renowned keynote speaker, and the author of Global Supply Chain Ecosystems. Mark's enlightening and informative presentations explore the supply chain implications of critical megatrends that are impacting almost every business: globalization shifts, the e-commerce frenzy, digital disruption, the Asian century, and the coronavirus pandemic. So now please welcome Mr. Millar and his speech of the next normal for global supply chain in a post-pandemic world.
Hi, this is Mark Millar, author of the book Global Supply Chain Ecosystems, and I'm delighted to join this DIGITIMES webinar today to share my thoughts and insights on the next normal for global supply chains in a post-pandemic world. It's increasingly obvious that yesterday's well-established supply chains have become progressively more vulnerable in today's increasingly volatile world. The coronavirus crisis has vividly exposed the profound interdependencies in today's global supply chain ecosystems and powerfully demonstrated the inherent risks and increased volatility in our complex connected world. We're now on the cusp of a thrilling new era for supply chain. Here is my roadmap for our discussion today. First of all, I will reflect on the COVID disruptions and see where we are up to right now. Secondly, I'm going to have a look at some ongoing turbulence, which is going to impact how things pan out through the next few years. And then thirdly, I'm going to have a look at the next normal. What might supply chain 25 look like? And look at some key logistics industry dynamics that are taking place and will manifest themselves through this decade. So first of all, COVID disruptions. There's no question this COVID pandemic has been massive. It's absolutely been global. It's very long lasting, and there's still a large amount of uncertainty and volatility lingering around. The consequences of COVID have been a huge imbalance between supply and demand. And this has resulted in disequilibrium in the supply chain, whereby the market has fallen out of balance. From the logistics perspective, we have a COVID-induced supply chain gridlock. On the sea freight, for example, we have container ports around the world that have queues of ships outside the port at anchor, waiting days, sometimes weeks, to be able to come into the port to berth and discharge their cargo and load new cargo for their onward journey. When it comes to air freight, the withdrawal of passenger airplanes from the global aviation system as a result of the pandemic meant that there was a significant shortage of capacity for air cargo. As you can see in this picture, some airlines resorted to actually putting packages of cargo on the passenger seats and strapping them in. Some airlines went one step further and removed all the passenger seats so that they could use the whole passenger deck for cargo. Now, this congestion in the sea freight and the air freight, and indeed stoppages and shortages at factories, resulted in the warehousing sector becoming overwhelmed. It became clogged up and log jammed with products, components, finished goods that were unable to move through the warehouse due to either transport restrictions, demand fluctuations, or border closures. And then further exacerbating this, the final piece of the jigsaw was in the trucking sector. The trucking sector was already suffering from a shortage of truck drivers. In the United States last year, there were 80,000 truck driver vacancies that were not filled. Along came COVID and further exacerbated this problem. We had truck drivers that got sick and were unable to work. We had transport limitations that meant that some drivers could not actually get to work. We then had transport restrictions, city borders, interstate borders, international borders became restricted or closed. So this whole ecosystem ended up in gridlock, to such an extent that chief executives of multinational companies are increasingly concerned about supply chain risk, supply chain execution, supply chain resilience is now top of mind, top of the boardroom agenda, because this chaos is unprecedented. A recent survey by Alex Partners talked about how CEOs are now in fear that they will lose their jobs because of supply chain issues. The top three items here, number one was the CEOs that are concerned about their broken supply chains. On top of that was worker shortages, also impacting supply chains, and poorly managed IT systems and networks. And we heard from KPMG recently that supply chain is the greatest risk for businesses, and that 68% of the CEOs they talk to recognize that their organizations must increase their resilience. Whether they all know how to do that is another question. So we're in a gridlock, and it's now firmly on the CEO agenda. Now, going forward, there are three key areas of ongoing turbulence that are clouding the landscape for global supply chains. First of all, we have this seemingly long-running tension between the world's superpowers. The US-China tensions, triggered probably during the Trump era, but continued under the Biden era, and feels sometimes like it's deteriorating further. This relationship that is the most important, most strategic, and most complex relationship of the 21st century. Secondly, looks to be an enduring issue is this Ukraine crisis. We're coming up for the 6-month anniversary of the start of this troubles between Russia and Ukraine. And it's tragic from a humanitarian perspective, but it also has widespread supply chain implications, and there's no sign of it abating anytime soon. There have been the most severe economic sanctions have been imposed on Russia, predominantly by the West and its allies. These are widespread and deep economic sanctions, and this is impacting business and trade and finance. Specifically for some global supply chains, both Russia and Ukraine are key suppliers of some precious metals, some raw materials that go to feed into other global supply chains. And in particular, as it pertains to what we call the bread basket, they are key suppliers of grain and cereals. Russia, for example, normally exports $6 billion of wheat every year. That is now under severe sanctions by most of the Western economies, so they are looking for alternative sources of wheat. Ukraine supplies 15% of the global supply of grain, and up until last week, that grain product was trapped in Ukraine, unable to travel. Last week, we saw the first outbound shipment of grain from Ukraine through a protected navigation channel, and we hope that that will continue. But even so, there are millions of tons of grain trapped in Ukraine that cannot be exported to nations that depend on that supply for their bread and cereal products. So these sanctions are pretty severe, and the transportation restrictions are pretty severe. Obviously, the borders are pretty much closed, so imports, exports, transport in and out is very restricted. And also the trade routes, the Black Sea ports are effectively dysfunctional. The airspace is pretty much closed over what is quite a large landmass. And there are implications also for the Silk Road. Interesting, the Silk Road, or the Silk Railroad actually, became a source of transit from China to Europe last year during the depths of the COVID crisis, while there was severe limitations on capacity for container shipping. Rail connections from China to Europe last year transported 1 million additional containers over the previous year. Now, those routes, most of them go through Russia. So those routes are closed. So those 1 million containers are now looking for alternative transport sources to get from Asia through to Europe at a time where there's still massive congestion in the container shipping sector. And then thirdly, we have China's approach to COVID is their specific dynamic zero policy. And this entails stringent and severe widespread lockdowns in response to the outbreak of localized cases. So what we've seen this year is as Omicron has permeated into China through their very tight border controls, as it breaks out, even in a major city like Shanghai, there is a widespread lockdown. This picture here is the Bund in Shanghai. Population about 23 million people, the commercial capital of mainland China. And Shanghai was locked down, full lockdown for the best part of the month of April. And this sent jitters around the world about supply and supply chain. Shanghai is home to the world's largest container port. And in the second quarter, this picture on the left here shows the congestion, the queuing outside of the port for ships waiting to come into a Shanghai container port. Likewise, Shanghai is the world's third largest air cargo airport, so ramifications there as well. Now, it also hit the industrial production. This is the PMI index. Generally speaking, PMI measures industrial output or contraction. A level 50 or above indicates growth, and a level below 50 indicates contraction. So you can see here on this chart the ramifications of the COVID crisis and the lockdowns in China on the industrial production. But it's not just the industrial production. Consumer confidence has taken a huge hit, particularly from these citywide mass lockdowns this year. You can see here, this is Bloomberg in June of this year, published their consumer confidence index for China, and you can see how confidence has substantially dropped. So this filters through to the major economic indicators, retail sales and industrial production, both having a tough time at the moment. So companies who are producing their products in China are concerned. Companies who are selling their products in China likewise are concerned, as are investors and, of course, the Chinese authorities and the Chinese consumers. So those are three enduring issues that I believe, coupled together with everything that's going on in the last couple of years, is another nail in the coffin for globalization. I think when we look back, in the future, when we look back, we will see this period as globalization coming to a conclusion of what it has been for the last 30 years of expansion and going into a new phase. So this new phase, the next normal as it's often called, what is this going to look like from a global supply chain perspective as we eventually get to an element of a post-pandemic world? Well, if we think about supply chain 2025 and beyond through the rest of this decade, I foresee there are going to be some pretty radical shifts in supply chains. We will see diversification, we will see reconfiguration of the supply chain, and we will see relocation of sourcing and production activities. And these four key issues that I've just mentioned in the previous section are looking to be enduring issues. The US-China tensions have been going on for several years. COVID, we're now in our third year. The Russia-Ukraine crisis, there looks like no end in sight. And this ongoing dynamic zero approach to COVID in the mainland, the world's largest manufacturer and the largest consumption market. So I think this is the time when we come to a point where globalization becomes stalled. And it is inevitable that there will be an element of decoupling. So what might this look like? Well, when we think about reconfiguring the supply chain, we often talk about the relocation of production. These discussions surface from time to time. Normally, there's not much action, but this time there will be action because these factors are so deep, so impactful, and so global, and the CEOs are so concerned that there will be action. So we talk about moving the sourcing and or the production from China or from Asia closer to the destination market, which is called nearshoring, or moving it back into the destination market, which is called reshoring, also known as onshoring. So in the nearshoring example, Mexico is the key beneficiary to serve North America. And we're already seeing some production being set up in Mexico to serve North America. They have their North America Free Trade Agreement. In Europe scenario, Eastern Europe, Poland, Turkey, for example, are prime beneficiaries of this strategy. Reshoring or nearshoring, onshoring, sorry, is when you take the production and move it all the way back into America. Now, when these discussions surface, they're often sort of fleeting. But this time, we're going to see some real action. This is Bloomberg just published last month, and they've been monitoring for the last couple of years how much corporate, multinational corporation, corporate presentations, earnings calls, CEO speeches talk about shifting their supply chain. And you can see how, as these issues have gone on for some time, in the first and second quarter of this year, the attention to shifting the supply chain has substantially increased. So I think we're going to see some real action. And what's critical is that robotics and automation will play a key role. Obviously, when we talk about reshoring a supply chain into a first world economy, labor and the cost and availability thereof becomes a big topic of discussion. And this is where I think we will see robotics and automation have much more widespread deployment as supply chains get reconfigured and get closer to or back into the destination markets. Let's not forget, in our 30 years of globalization, labor rates in first world markets have more than doubled. The cost of robotics has more than halved. So the economic modeling of an automation opportunity is now completely different to when we started the automation journey. This is reinforced by a survey just 2 months ago by ABB, looking at executives from the US and from Europe about who's planning changes in their supply chain operation. More than 1/3 are planning to bring production back into the United States. That would obviously require automation. Another third are looking to nearshore their operations to a closer location. And 43%, as you can see, will use automation and robotics to enable this reshoring journey, but to build supply chain resilience. So this time is different. This time we're going to see some real action. So the question is, what about your China supply chain? What's the strategy there? Well, there's not going to be a mass exit from China, not by any means, but there will be some diversification. Gartner identified that 1/3 of their clients would have moved or were planning to have moved by 2023 some of their production out of China. And when companies are evaluating what to do about their China supply chain, there are 3 strategies that they could consider and adopt, and they're by no means mutually exclusive. Many companies will be adopting some of all of these 3 strategies. The first strategy for China supply chain is what we call China Plus. This is where an additional location, typically somewhere else around the Asia region, is used to either substitute or supplement the existing China manufacturing. Key beneficiary in this scenario is Vietnam. Large population, low cost labor rates, and has seen a lot of overflow and additional manufacturing set up there, either to substitute or supplement China production. Other countries around Asia are key beneficiaries. Cambodia, for example, Bangladesh, Indonesia. These all have relatively large labor forces at lower cost labor rates than China. A Baker McKenzie survey of their clients identified 42% of them are pursuing a China Plus strategy. The second strategy for China's supply chain is what I mentioned earlier. It's the nearshoring or reshoring of the supply chain. Now, the challenge here is that this is a major undertaking. A nearshoring or reshoring configuration of your global supply chain typically would be a multi-year project. It's not flicking a switch and having it all done within a month or 2. This takes a long time in the planning, the modeling, the risk analysis, and then the actual appointment of all the various parties that are going to be involved, and then the move itself. And of course, whilst you're doing all that, you still have to run your business on a day-to-day basis. So that is not for the faint-hearted, but as we've seen from survey after survey, the Bloomberg one I just mentioned, companies are now taking this very seriously, and the CEOs are giving direction for the supply chain executives to get these initiatives underway. The third strategy for your China supply chain is for all those companies that are selling into the China domestic market. There is obviously no point in moving that production outside of China. In fact, it would be detrimental to your business to do so. So the approach is what we are going to sell in China, we will continue to make in China, and some of the products that aren't made in China at the moment, maybe we will reconfigure that supply chain to have it made in China in the future. So we have the China Plus strategy, the nearshoring or reshoring strategy, and then the in China for China strategy. And it's interesting to reflect over the 30 years that I've been involved in global supply chains, enjoying this fantastic globalization journey, interested to reflect that the multinational corporations in China 30 years ago, they came to China for the workers. Now they stay in China as much for the shoppers because we have the largest consumption market in the world. So that's the 3 options for your China supply chain strategy. But wherever your supply chain, the next normal is going to be less global, more regional, more local, and therefore the supply chains are going to be shorter. Now, shorter supply chains will result in multiple business benefits, some key ones being we can reduce our lead times, we can reduce our freight costs, we can reduce the emissions, which is important for the world and the environment. At the same time, a shorter supply chain also enables us to increase our control over what's happening. We can increase our responsiveness to fluctuations in market demand because the supply chain is shorter. And overall, we can increase our supply chain resilience. So multiple business benefits to reconfigured supply chains that are more regional, more local, and therefore shorter. Now, the logistics sector is a key element, of course, within the supply chain. And there are four key dynamics I want to share with you about logistics that have all been super accelerated by the pandemic and by these enduring ongoing turbulence. First of all is modal shifts. There's been a lot of cargo that used to travel by one mode. When mode, we're talking about mode, we're talking about truck or train or ship or aeroplane. So there's been modal shifts happening in response to how the COVID and the other tensions have been impacting transportation routes. So it's not necessarily A to B to C anymore. There are multiple diversions along the journey in order to get the products to their destination. Secondly is the e-commerce frenzy. There are 2.1 trillion people shopping online at the moment. Last year spending over $4 trillion and generating 158 billion parcel packages traveling all over the world. More than half of all e-commerce is now cross-border. That's a consumer in one country using their computer to go online and buy products from another country, which results in a cross-border transaction. And both the volume of revenue and the quantity of packages are forecast to increase by 50% over the next 2 years. The third area is digitalization in logistics. Digitalization on the broader picture, but specifically in logistics. Turbocharged by the pandemic, as was e-commerce, is the adoption of digital solutions in the warehouse, addressing efficiencies, addressing labor shortages, addressing reducing human-to-human contact. And then the fourth element is further consolidation in the industry. We've seen in the last 12 months some major deals, shipping lines getting involved in air freight, port terminal operators buying logistics companies, as well as logistics companies buying logistics companies. So these four key logistics industry dynamics are continuing through as we reconfigure the supply chain for 2025 onwards. So before I go into the conclusion, let me just recap. I've looked at the next normal for global supply chains in a post-pandemic world on three dimensions. First of all, I reflected on the COVID disruptions and how we've reached this point of supply chain gridlock, and the C-suite are increasingly concerned and increasingly getting involved in directing change for the future. Secondly, I outlined three key streams of ongoing turbulence. The China-US superpower relationship tensions. Secondly, the Russia-Ukraine crisis ongoing. And thirdly, the China dynamic zero approach to COVID, unsettling markets, dampening consumer confidence, and slowing down industrial production. Thirdly, I looked out to the next normal, supply chain 25 and beyond, and how supply chains will get reconfigured, three alternative China supply chain strategies, and four key logistics sector dynamics. So as we look to the post-pandemic world, it is undoubtedly going to be even more complex, even more connected, even more digital, and even more uncertain. And all of those factors will be overlaid by the lingering hangover of COVID, which will be through it with us for the next several years to come. And whether that's a COVID passport, COVID certificates, COVID testing on products, it's going to have a lingering effect on everything we do from a global supply chain perspective in the post-pandemic world. So what is the outlook? Well, I'm afraid it's going to be more stormy seas for some years to come. But in that arena, there are four key strategic priorities that every supply chain leader and every business leader and C-suite should be prioritizing as strategic initiatives. Number one is resilience. Resilience in the supply chain, but also resilience across the business. Supply chains have been brutally exposed by the COVID pandemic. And all the companies, as we saw, the KPMG survey, the Axel survey, need to build more resilience, greater resilience. Secondly is the sustainability agenda. There's no doubt now that we are seeing climatic issues that are impacting people's lives and impacting supply chains. Consumers now, 6 out of 10 consumers, according to IBM, say that they would change their purchasing behavior based on their perception of a product or company's environmental footprint of their supply chain. Thirdly is digitalization. This is a journey that would be familiar to many of the DIGITIMES community. But companies beyond that have to get on board with the digitalization journey. It probably takes a few years, but they must get started and adopt and deploy more digital technologies. And then the fourth one is the visibility. The McKinsey survey identified that only 48% of companies have good visibility into their tier 1 suppliers, and only a fifth of companies have visibility in their tier 2 suppliers. If you don't have visibility across your supply chain, then you're going to have unexpected events happening, and this happened a lot during the COVID crisis. So these 4 key priorities are strategic capabilities that every supply chain executive and every business leader needs to have in their portfolio: resilience, sustainability, digitalization, and visibility. So to finish off, with all this uncertainty comes opportunity. Are you prepared? Are you ready to embrace these uncertainties, to seize the opportunities, and to enhance your digital capabilities? This is Mark Millar on the DIGITIMES webinar. A pleasure to be with you today. Thank you for your time.
I'd like to remind all of you that don't forget to fill the feedback form to win your gift. And your opinion is highly valued. Once again, thank you all for your time today. I'm your MC, Rebecca. See you next time.